They mocked the homeless man at the wedding, until he pulled out the deed to the venue. Laughter filled the grand hall, cruel and careless, aimed at a man they thought had no place among them. His clothes were worn, his presence unwelcome, and every whisper cut deeper than the last. Yet within his satchel lay the power to silence them all, to turn shame into shock in a single breath. And so the story begins with that moment of ridicule, on a day meant for joy, when judgment reigned louder than kindness. The wedding day had arrived in all its grandeur. The sun poured through towering windows, casting warm light across polished marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, their delicate glass arms scattering golden sparks across the hall. A string quartet played softly in the corner, every note crafted to remind the guests of elegance, refinement, and superiority. Everywhere you looked, wealth had been stitched into the details. Tables lined with silk cloths shimmered under the weight of silver cutlery. Roses, flown in from abroad, spilled out of crystal vases. Even the air carried the faint aroma of wealth, a mixture of perfume, wine, and polished wood. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration of power. The guests reflected that same declaration. Women in gowns worth more than a year's wages sparkled with jewels. Men in tailored suits spoke with easy confidence, each handshake a silent contest of status. Their laughter rose and fell in rehearsed rhythms, as if they too were instruments in the orchestra of the evening. It was a gathering where appearances mattered more than truth, where image was everything. And then the doors opened. The sound was small a hinge groaning against the golden hush of violins, but it was enough. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Into the sea of satin and silk stepped a man who looked as though he had stumbled from another world entirely. His coat was old, its fabric frayed at the edges, sleeves hanging too loose. His shoes were scuffed, their soles worn thin by years of walking streets no one in that room had ever dared to walk. His hair was disheveled, falling untamed across his forehead, and a shadow of days without shaving covered his face. In his hand, he clutched a weathered satchel, the leather cracked, the handle close to tearing. The contrast was brutal, almost offensive to the senses. He looked like a stain on a spotless canvas, an interruption in their carefully curated performance. At first, the room reacted with silence, stunned, heavy silence. Then came the whispers. "Who is that?" one guest murmured. "How did he get in?" another hissed. "He doesn't belong here." Their voices slithered through the air, sharp and poisonous. The whispers became smirks, and soon the smirks twisted into laughter. A young man near the back leaned toward his companion, his voice dripping with cruelty. "He must have come for the food. Look at him, has starving." Their chuckles rose above the violins, breaking the delicate harmony of the music. The laughter grew bolder, louder. Women covered their mouths, not out of kindness, but to hide their grins. Men shook their heads with mocking pity, as if the man were a creature that had wandered into the wrong cage. The humiliation spread like fire, each snicker feeding the next until the entire hall was burning with ridicule. The man, however, walked steadily forward. His posture did not falter, his gaze did not lower. Each step echoed louder than the music itself, a reminder that he was not lost nor mistaken. He belonged there even if no one else believed it. He chose an empty seat at the back. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself into the chair, the satchel never leaving his grip. His expression betrayed no anger. But behind his calm eyes, there was something deeper, something heavier than the cruel words bouncing around the hall. He had been mocked before. He had been judged by strangers who thought they knew his worth. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the mockery would end. They saw a beggar. They believed he was nothing. Yet in his satchel rested the very truth that would turn their laughter into silence. But who was this man? And why did he dare to walk into such a place? The wedding unfolded like a spectacle designed not just to celebrate love, but to showcase wealth. The hall shimmered as if every detail had been rehearsed for months. Waiters in crisp white gloves moved like clockwork, their trays laden with champagne flutes that caught and reflected the light of the chandeliers. With every turn of the head, there was something extravagant to admire. Towering arrangements of roses imported from foreign gardens, candles burning in golden holders, and tables draped with silk cloths so fine that guests whispered about their cost as though it were another jewel in the bride's dowry. Guests mingled with the air of people who believed themselves untouchable. They spoke in loud, proud tones, eager to be overheard. Every compliment was laced with competition, every story twisted to highlight who had more, who knew more, who could spend more. Their laughter wasn't carefree, it was calculated, sharp around the edges, like glass polished until it could cut. This was a gathering of hearts. It was a pageant of power. At the center of it all, the bride sparkled in a gown that seemed more fantasy than fabric. Every fold of lace shimmered with beads. Every stitch whispered of wealth. The veil floated behind her like a cloud of spun glass, and when she walked, gasps trailed her footsteps. But those gasps weren't entirely about her beauty. They were about the designer label, the cost, the privilege of wearing a dress most would never dare to dream of affording. To the guests, she wasn't just a bride, she was a trophy, proof of her family's riches and reach. Beside her stood the groom, broad-shouldered in his custom-tailored suit. He smiled with the confidence of a man who knew that his marriage wasn't only to a woman, but to an empire. His family hovered nearby, their expressions smug, their eyes drinking in every sign of approval. For them, this union was less about devotion and more about what it symbolized: a merger, a deal, a strengthening of names that already carried weight in the city. But it was the bride's father who commanded the room as though the day belonged to him alone. He moved with booming laughter, clapping shoulders, shaking hands, reminding everyone that this celebration was his achievement. Every word he spoke was gilded with pride, and every gesture carried the unspoken message: "Look what I can afford. Look what I control." He relished the admiration, thrived on the envy. In his eyes, this day was not about love, it was about legacy. And then, in the back of the hall, there sat the man who did not belong. His coat, worn and threadbare, absorbed none of the glittering light. His shoes, battered and weary, looked out of place on marble polished to perfection. His hair was unkempt, his face marked by hardship. He carried only a satchel, old and cracked, as if it too had weathered years of neglect. Every time someone's gaze fell upon him, the illusion of perfection wavered. He was like a crack in glassiflaw that threatened to spread until it ruined the whole reflection. Guests whispered louder each time they noticed him, their voices filled with derision. Who invited him? One woman scoffed, tugging her jeweled shawl tighter. He must be lost, another muttered, unwilling to believe that someone like him had been allowed past the doors. The whispers grew crueler. He must be here for the food, a young man sneered. earning chuckles from his companions. Or perhaps the warmth. The streets must be cold tonight. A woman leaned closer to her husband and said, "It's disgraceful. Someone should remove him before the photos are ruined." Their words spread like venom, poisoning the air until the entire hall seemed to pulse with mockery. And yet the man did not respond. He sat still, his satchel resting against his leg, his eyes calm. There was no anger in his expression, no trace of shame. There was only patience, and almost unsettling patience, as though he had been through this all before and knew that their cruelty would exhaust itself in time. He did not argue with them, did not rise to defend himself. He allowed them to laugh, to sneer, to believe the lies their wealth whispered into their ears. For they did not know what he knew. They did not see what he carried. They did not realize that beneath the glitter and glass, beneath the boasting and pride, beneath the roses and silk, everything they celebrated stood on ground that was his. The chandeliers they so admired, the marble floor they polished to perfection. The estate they rented to showcase their triumphal of it belonged to the man they mocked. To them, he was a beggar. To him, they were actors on a stage he owned. And the truth of that stage sat hidden inside the weathered satchel at his side, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. But who exactly was he before the world stripped him bare? What kind of life had carved both dignity and silence into his soul? To understand that, the story must leave the wedding hall and return to the life he once lived, the life that brought him here. Long before the whispers of mockery in that wedding hall, long before the cruel laughter and the rolled eyes, the man they ridiculed had lived another kind of life. His name was Thomas Hale. To the guests that day, he was just a ragged stranger, a stain on their perfect celebration. But once, Thomas had been a man others respected, admired even. His story was one of hard work, love, loss, and endurance. A story few knew, and even fewer cared to imagine. Thomas grew up the son of a blacksmith in a small village where wealth was measured in the calluses on a man's hands, rather than coins in his pocket. His father's forge was hot, loud, and unforgiving. From dawn to dusk, sparks danced in, the air as iron bent beneath the hammer. It was in that fire that Thomas learned his first lesson. Nothing worth keeping came without effort. His father often said, "Iron does not shape itself, son. You must strike it again and again, until it takes the form you desire." Life is no different. As a boy, Thomas carried those words like scripture. He worked alongside his father, earning his first blisters before he could even read. But he was not destined to remain at the forge. He had a mind that wandered beyond the anvil, a mind that saw opportunities in land, in stone, in timber. While his father hammered steel, Thomas watched the way the town grew where people built homes, where traders gathered, where roads stretched outward. He noticed patterns others overlooked. He saw how land that seemed worthless one year became invaluable the next, when a road was paved nearby or a market sprouted from nothing. By the time he was a young man, Thomas was saving every coin he could. He worked construction jobs, carrying bricks, hauling timber, laying stone foundations. At night, exhausted but determined, he studied property ledgers by candlelight. He asked questions, learned from anyone willing to speak, and taught himself to read contracts, maps, and deeds. His friends mocked him for studying instead of drinking. "Thomas, you'll die with sore hands and nothing to show for it," they teased. But Thomas didn't answer with words, he answered with patience. Slowly he began to buy land. Not the prime estates others fought over, but small, overlooked parcels on the outskirts of town. Land people dismissed as barren, unworthy, too far away from the bustle of life. "Why waste your coins on that?" neighbors would ask. "It's just fields, nothing more." Thomas would smile faintly and reply, "Land waits longer than men. One day you'll see." And in time they did. Roads stretched toward those fields. Merchants built stalls. Families laid foundations for homes. The value of Thomas's land grew, and so did his reputation. By the age of 30, he was no longer just a laborer, he was a landowner. People who once laughed now shook his hand with respect, admiring his foresight. It was during these years of quiet success that Thomas met Margaret. She was not wealthy, nor was she from a family of influence, but she was strong-willed, warm, and sharp-eyed. Margaret believed in him even before others did. She would often remind him, "Thomas, wealth is not measured in land or coin. It is measured in how you carry yourself and how you treat others." Her words tempered him, softened the hard edges ambition had carved into his heart. Together, they dreamed of building not just a life, but a legacy. They married in a modest church, exchanging vows without the luxury of gold or diamonds. Their wealth was in their laughter, in the small home they built, in the way they leaned on each other. And for many years, life was kind to them. Thomas continued to grow his holdings, eventually purchasing a large estate on the edge of the city. It was a property most overlooked, a stretch of land dotted with old stone walls and thick trees. But Thomas saw more. He saw what it could become, a haven, a place where grand halls could one day stand. He signed the deed with steady hands, proud that he had secured something lasting, something that could outlive him. But life, as Thomas had learned from the forge, often strikes without mercy. Margaret fell ill. At first it was subtle fatigue, a cough, a fleeting weakness she brushed aside. "It's nothing, Thomas," she would say, forcing a smile. But Thomas knew better. He saw the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the way her face paled as she tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. Doctor visits turned into hospital stays, and hospital stays became nights spent in sterile rooms where the smell of medicine overpowered the smell of home. Thomas spent everything he had trying to save her. He sold parcels of land, drained savings, and cashed in investments. Each time he signed a contract, he told himself it was worth it. Each time he handed over gold, he told himself it was buying more time. But the disease was relentless, and money could not halt its march. Margaret grew weaker until one gray morning she slipped away in her sleep. The loss broke him. Without her, the land meant nothing. The estate, once his pride, now stood as an empty reminder of dreams they would never share. He could not bear to live there. He left it in the hands of managers, men who promised to rent it, to maintain it, to make it useful. He walked away, carrying only Margaret's ring in his pocket and grief heavy in his chest. Grief has a way of hollowing a man. For Thomas, the days blurred into nights. The seasons passed without meaning. Without Margaret, ambition lost its flavor. The fortune he once built slipped through his fingers. He wandered from place to place, often with no roof over his head, until strangers began to call him what they thought he was, homeless. But that word was never the full truth. Yes, Thomas slept in shelters and under bridges. Yes, his clothes grew worn, his hands rougher, his hair wild. But he was not a man without a home. In his satchel, he carried the deed to the estate, a folded document that bore his name. It was the last piece of his former life, the last thread connecting him to the man he had once been. He kept it not out of pride, but out of reverence. It was proof that once he had built something from nothing. Proof that Margaret's husband had been a man of vision, honor, and perseverance. And so, when he walked into the wedding hall on that fateful day, enduring the laughter and the ridicule, Thomas was not shaken. He had been laughed at before. He had been judged by strangers who thought they knew his worth. He had survived deeper pain than their shallow scorn. Their words could not undo him. What they didn't know, what none of them could imagine, was that the ground beneath their polished shoes, the chandeliers above, the roses on their tables, the marble floors they danced upon, all of it still belonged to him. And inside his satchel lay the very document that would silence their jeers and expose the truth. They thought they were mocking a beggar. In reality, they were mocking the master of the house. And soon they would discover just how wrong they were. The estate where the wedding now glittered had not always looked like this. Long before the chandeliers cast their golden glow, before roses filled the air with their perfume, before laughter and wine filled the hall, it had been nothing more than a stretch of forgotten land. Overgrown grass, crumbling stone walls, a place others dismissed as worthless. But Thomas Hale had seen differently. He had stood on that soil years ago, closed his eyes and imagined what it could be. Where others saw decay, he saw possibility. Where they saw emptiness, he saw a foundation waiting for a dream. It was that vision that had guided him to purchase the land at a price so low that neighbors chuckled behind his back. Old Thomas, they said, always chasing ghosts in the dirt. But Thomas was patient. He knew land never lost its memory. He signed the deed, tucked it away, and quietly built a future on soil no one else valued. When fortune was kinder, he had poured resources into shaping the estate. The grounds were cleared, the foundations reinforced, and slowly, stone by stone, the great hall rose. It wasn't yet the grand palace it would become, but the bones were there, the wide arches, the tall windows, the vast floors waiting to be polished. Thomas dreamed of walking there with Margaret, of hosting their family, of filling the rooms with laughter that was theirs. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Margaret's illness stole his attention and his fortune. With her gone, Thomas no longer cared for marble or roses. He placed the estate in the care of managers who promised to maintain it, to rent it out, to keep it alive. And then grief pushed him away. He walked from the estate and never returned. To the world, it seemed abandoned. To the families who later rented it, it became simply another venue, another hall with a name but no story. Years passed, and with time came forgetfulness. The managers, eager for profit, spoke less and less of Thomas. New clients signed contracts, paid deposits, and believed the estate belonged to the faceless company that handled its bookings. The truth of its ownership sank into the shadows, hidden behind paperwork and the silence of a man who no longer sought recognition. Thomas never corrected them. He didn't care to. His heart was too heavy with loss, his spirit too weary to argue. Let them believe what they wished, he thought. Yet through all those years, through all the wandering, Thomas never let go of the deed. Folded and refolded until its creases were worn white, it lived inside his satchel like a heartbeat. Some nights, when the cold cut through his coat, he would take it out, unfold it, and run his fingers across the ink of his name. It reminded him that though the world called him homeless, he was not rootless. Though they saw a beggar, he was an owner. Though they mocked his rags, he held in his hands the proof of a legacy that could not be erased. And so, when he walked into the wedding hall that night, he walked not as an intruder, but as a man returning to his own house. The chandeliers that glowed above, the marble floors beneath polished shoes, the roses that lined the table saw of it stood on his ground. Every brick, every stone, every gleaming surface had once been touched by his vision, built from the soil he claimed. The guests did not know. The bride's father, puffed with pride, believed he had rented the venue from faceless businessmen. The groom's family thought their wealth had secured them the grandest hall in the city. The guests whispered about luxury, as though it belonged to the families standing before them. None of them realized that the man in rags, the one they mocked, was the very reason the hall existed at all. To them, he was invisible, laughable, disposable. To him, they were simply tenants playing dress-up in a house they did not own. And the time was coming sooner than they expected when the forgotten owner would remind them. The whispers had begun like faint ripples across a pond, soft, subtle, easy to dismiss. But whispers have a way of growing, of feeding one another, and soon they became a tide of mockery that threatened to drown the hall. The man in rags, seated at the back, had become their target. He was no longer simply a guest. He was their amusement, a cruel distraction woven into the glittering fabric of the wedding. At first, it was only glances. Women leaning slightly over their glasses, eyes narrowing in disapproval. Men arching their brows, lips twitching into condescending smirks. Even the musicians seemed unsettled, their bows faltering for a moment when the ragged figure had stepped through the doors. The harmony of the violins carried on, but beneath the music another rhythm grew, the rhythm of ridicule. A guest near the center whispered sharply to her husband, "Who allowed that man in here? This is supposed to be a respectable event." Her husband chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. Perhaps he mistook it for a shelter. Poor fool. Doesn't he see he doesn't belong? The words spread like embers, catching quickly on dry grass. A young man at a nearby table, already warmed by drink, leaned back in his chair and raised his voice louder than necessary. Maybe he's here to give us a glimpse of the future. Waste your life, and that's what you become. A ghost, haunting weddings for free food. His companions burst into laughter, slapping the table, their mockery echoing through the grand hall. The groomsmen, proud in their sharp suits, grew restless as well. One of them, tall and brash, finally rose from his seat. With a smirk stretched across his face, he strode toward the back, each step heavy with arrogance. The room seemed to hold its breath, eager to see what would happen. Stopping in front of Thomas, the groomsman tilted his head, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You look lost, old man. Did you wander in here by mistake? This isn't the charity hall." His words carried, echoing off the marble floors and bouncing beneath the chandeliers. Guests chuckled, some covering their mouths with jeweled hands, others laughing openly. It was a performance, and the groomsman was proud to be their actor. Thomas did not move. He looked at the man, calm and steady, his hand resting on the worn leather satchel at his side. His silence was unsettling, but the groomsman mistook it for weakness. Leaning closer, he whispered cruelly, "Why don't you leave before someone has to drag you out? You don't belong here." The cruelty was fuel for the crowd. A woman near the front, draped in pearls, said loudly enough to be heard, "It's disgraceful. Imagine letting such a man sully the photographs." Another added, "Perhaps we should pack him leftovers and send him on his way." That would be the kindest thing to do. Their voices were venom disguised as civility, their laughter sharp as broken glass. The bride's father, standing proudly near the head table, glanced toward the commotion, his lips curled into a smirk, his pride untouchable. He muttered to a guest beside him, "Pathetic. That's what becomes of men who fail. He should have stayed outside where he belongs." He spoke it with satisfaction, as though the man's suffering somehow elevated his own triumph. But still, Thomas did not rise. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He sat quietly, shoulders squared, gaze steady. Each insult seemed to fall upon him like rain upon stone, sliding off without leaving a mark. He had endured storms harsher than their laughter, grief deeper than their shallow cruelty. Their voices could not reach the depths of his scars. And yet, his silence made some uneasy. One guest muttered nervously, "Why doesn't he say something? Why doesn't he leave?" Another replied, "Because beggars don't know their place. He's probably too proud to walk away." They didn't know the truth. They couldn't imagine that the man they mocked was not clinging to their charity, but to a secret far greater than their wealth. The satchel at his side, worn and fraying, held more power than all their jewels, all their boasts, all their sneers. And when the moment came, it would shatter their illusion like glass dropped upon stone. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, Thomas endured. He let them laugh. He let them sneer. He let them build the walls of their arrogance higher and higher, because he knew the higher they built them, the harder they would crumble when the truth came crashing down. They thought they had stripped him of dignity. They thought they had won. But humiliation was only the stage upon which his revelation would rise. And before long, the first crack in their arrogance would appear not from Thomas himself, but from someone unexpected. Someone whose memory reached back further than the glitter of this wedding day. The laughter rolled on, cruel and careless, but not every heart in the hall was blind. At the head table, beneath the glow of chandeliers and the heavy weight of expectation, the bride sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She tried to smile as her father boasted, and her guests cackled, but her eyes were not fixed on the glittering gowns or the polished marble floor. Her gaze had drifted to the back of the hall, to the man they mocked. Something about him unsettled her. Not his ragged clothes or his unkempt hair, but something deeper, something hidden beneath the years of weariness etched into his face. She tilted her head, her brows knitting as she studied him. Memories, faint and fragile, stirred at the edges of her mind. She remembered summers from her childhood, long before her family's wealth had swelled into arrogance. Her parents had taken her to an estate they rented then, when life seemed simpler. She recalled running barefoot through open fields, climbing over stone walls and watching a man work with quiet diligence. He was kind to her, always smiling, always patient when she asked endless questions. He had shown her how to balance on a fallen log, how to whistle with a blade of grass between her thumbs. She had never forgotten the warmth of his laughter, though the years had buried the memory beneath layers of time. Now, looking at the man in rags, she felt a shiver of recognition. Could it be the same man? The years had aged him, yes, carved sorrow into his features, but his eyes, those eyes had not changed. They still carried the same quiet strength she remembered from her childhood. "Father," she whispered, leaning slightly toward him. "Do you know who that man is? I think I've seen him before, a long time ago." Her father's expression hardened. the lines of his face stiffening with irritation. "Nonsense," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "He's nobody. A vagrant who stumbled in. Don't waste your thoughts on him." "But I am sure I've met him," she insisted softly, her voice nearly drowned by the clinking of glasses and the laughter around them. Her father leaned closer, his tone sharp, meant only for her ears. "Do not speak of him again. He doesn't belong here. He is beneath us. This is your wedding, and I will not have it spoiled by talk of a beggar." His words were like cold steel, meant to cut short her curiosity. The bride sat back, chastened but uneasy. She lowered her gaze to her hands, twisting the edge of her veil between nervous fingers. Yet the image of the man lingered in her thoughts. Why had her father reacted so harshly? Why did he seem almost angry at the suggestion that the man might be someone more than he appeared? The groomsman had returned to his seat, triumphant, as if he had won a battle by humiliating a stranger. Guests still chuckled in small clusters, the atmosphere thick with arrogance. But the bride could not join in. She could not laugh. Deep inside, a quiet voice told her that the man in rags carried more than his satchel. He carried a truth no one else in the room was willing to see. And, as she glanced once more toward him, their eyes met across the hall. For a brief second, it was as if the noise around them fell silent. His gaze was steady, unyielding, yet not unkind. She felt it strike something within her, a memory, a recognition, a reminder that appearances could deceive. The bride's unease grew, though she could not yet name why. But soon her father's arrogance would provide the answer, for it was in his pride, in the words he would speak before all the guests, that the first stone of truth would finally be turned. The hum of conversation faded as the string quartet softened their music to a whisper. Waiters glided across the floor like shadows, pouring champagne into tall crystal flutes, their movements rehearsed, precise, elegant. Then, with a commanding scrape of his chair against the polished marble floor, the bride's father rose to his feet. The hall seemed to tilt toward him. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even the chandeliers seemed to lean down, showering him in golden light as though he were the star of the evening. He adjusted his jacket, tugging at the silk lapel with practiced confidence, and lifted his glass high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rolling through the hall like the low rumble of a drum, steady and self-assured. "Tonight is no ordinary night. Tonight we celebrate not only love, but triumph. Not just a union of hearts, but a union of names, of families, of legacies." Polite applause rippled through the room. Some guests clapped because they believed him, others because they knew they were expected to. But all eyes stayed fixed on him. He basked in their attention, pausing deliberately, letting the silence remind everyone who commanded the room. "Look around you," he continued, sweeping his arm grandly to encompass the glittering chandeliers, the towering floral arrangements, the endless tables lined with silver and silk. "Look at this hall, at these tables, at this feast." This, his voice deepened, his smile widening's what success looks like. This is what legacy feels like. What you see tonight is proof of what determination, hard work, and family vision can build. Applause again, louder this time. A guest near the front shouted, "Hear, hear," and laughter followed. The father's chest swelled with pride. He was not a man speaking from the heart. He was a man performing for the history books he believed would remember him. Every gesture, every pause was calculated. He turned slightly toward his daughter, laying a hand on her shoulder. "My daughter," he declared, has chosen well. She has married into a family worthy of her own that matches our own in wealth, in standing, and in reputation. Together, they will not merely live, they will build. They will continue what we have built, and they will rise even higher. Tonight is proof that our legacy will not only endure, but expand. The bride lowered her gaze, her lips pressed together in a careful smile. To the crowd, it looked like modesty, but inside, her stomach twisted. She felt her father's hand heavy on her shoulder, the weight of his words pressing down on her like iron. This wasn't her night, it was his. He wasn't celebrating her happiness. He was parading his power. But the guests didn't notice her unease. They cheered, raising their glasses high. "To legacy," someone shouted, and a chorus of voices echoed it back. The father soaked in their approval, his grin widening, his eyes glittering with self-satisfaction. Then his tone shifted. Pride hardened into arrogance. His words, already sharp, turned into knives. "And this venue," he exclaimed, gesturing upward as though the chandeliers themselves were his to command. "This grand hall, these marble floors, these glittering lights, they speak of prestige, of privilege, of exclusivity. A place like this is not for everyone. It is not for the common, the ordinary, or the weak. It is for those who have proven themselves worthy." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, followed by laughter-short, arrogant bursts of sound that bounced against the marble walls. The father's gaze, sly and cutting, shifted toward the back of the hall, where Thomas sat quietly with his satchel. His smirk widened. "Some," he said, his voice suddenly slow, deliberate, cruel, "will never know what it is to belong in such a place. Some will always be on the outside looking in forgotten, invisible, pitied at best, mocked at worst." And tonight he paused, sipping his champagne, letting the silence stretch painfully long. Tonight, we are reminded of that truth. The words hit the hall like a spark in dry grass. Guests laughed, openly now, their voices filling the space. A man near the front guffawed and muttered, "He means the beggar." A woman added cruelly, "Oh, indeed? What a contrast." Laughter followed, swelling into a wave that rolled across the room. The bride stiffened. Her stomach tightened into knots, shame flushing her cheeks. She knew exactly who her father was mocking. Her eyes darted to the back of the hall to the man seated in silence. His face was calm, his posture steady. But his hand, resting on the worn leather satchel, had tightened into a fist. She saw it, even if no one else did. Her father's booming voice rose above the laughter. He lifted his glass high, his arrogance swelling with every cheer. "So let us toast," he bellowed, "to success, to legacy, and to knowing our place in this world." The hall erupted in cheers. Glasses clinked. Champagne sparkled in the light. The father stood triumphant, basking in the applause of people eager to flatter him. But at the back of the hall, Thomas sat unmoved. His silence was no longer patience, it was resolve. He had let them laugh, let them jeer, let them believe their illusions. But the time had come. The father had unknowingly written the perfect introduction. The stage was his, but the performance about to unfold would not be his triumph. It would be his undoing. The laughter still hung in the air like smoke after a fire thick, acrid, and choking. It clung to the walls of the grand hall, staining the chandeliers and echoing against the marble. For a moment, it seemed the ridicule would never end. The bride's father sat proudly at the head table, his chest swollen with triumph, his glass lifted high, basking in the sound of his guests feeding his pride. and then came a sound that did not belong. A chair scraped against the polished marble floor. The noise cut through the laughter like a blade, sharp and startling. The sound was simple, ordinary even, but in the silence that followed, it rang louder than any applause, heavier than any toast. All heads turned toward the back of the hall. There, rising slowly from his seat, was the man they had mocked. Thomas Hale stood, tall, though the years of hardship weighed on his frame. His coat, ragged and threadbare, slipped from his shoulders like a soldier's cloak worn thin from too many battles. His boots, cracked and weary, held firm on the marble, as if they had more right to stand upon it than the polished shoes of every guest combined. His face bore the weathering of grief and wandering, but his eyes were clear, steady, and unyielding. A hush swept through the hall. The laughter died on lips that suddenly felt dry. Even the violins faltered into silence, bows trembling in the hands of musicians who dared not play another note. With slow, deliberate movement, Thomas reached down to the satchel at his side. His fingers, worn but strong, traced the edges of the cracked leather as though he were greeting an old friend. The guests watched, their expressions shifting from disdain to unease. What could a beggar possibly carry that was worth this silent attention? He unbuckled the satchel and reached inside. The faint rustle of paper filled the hollow sound that should have been ordinary, but in the heavy silence it was deafening. He drew out a folder, worn and creased, its edges softened by years of handling. He held it carefully, almost reverently, as if it contained not just paper, but the weight of a lifetime. The bride's father chuckled, his voice too loud, too forced, cracking under a tension he did not yet understand. "What is this?" he sneered, though the sneer did not reach his eyes. "A trick? A scrap of paper from the street? Sit down, old man, before you embarrass yourself further." But Thomas did not sit. He did not falter. He unfolded the folder and lifted the first page, turning it outward for all to see. His voice, deep and steady, filled the hall. "This hall," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "This land, these walls, they belong to me." The words fell like thunder. Gasps erupted across the room. A woman dropped her glass, the champagne spilling across the silk tablecloth. A man coughed mid-laugh, choking on his own arrogance. Whispers buzzed like startled bees, frantic and disbelieving. "What did he say?" someone muttered. "Did he say it's his?" Another whispered, her hand trembling against her pearls. The father's smirk faltered, his color draining. "Nonsense!" he snapped, his voice rising too quickly, too sharply. "This man is a liar, a fraud. Don't listen to him." But Thomas did not back down. He stepped forward, his boots striking the marble with steady, echoing thuds. He raised the document higher, the wax seal glinting under the chandeliers, the inked signatures bold and undeniable. The name on the page, Thomas Hale, stared back at them like a ghost come to life. "This," he declared, his voice ringing through the stunned silence, "is the deed to this estate. Signed, sealed, and witnessed long before any of you ever thought to set foot in this hall. I bought this land with the work of my own hands. I built it stone by stone, vision by vision. And though time has weathered me, though the world has called me many names, pauper, wanderer, beggar, this truth has never changed. This place is mine." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some guests rose to their feet, craning their necks for a closer look. Others whispered furiously, clinging to denial. "It can't be true," one man muttered, his face pale. Surely this is some mistake. Yet the document in Thomas' hand, with its signatures and seals, told no lies. The bride gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes darted between the paper and the man holding it, memories flooding back. She remembered summers spent on this very land as a child, before her father claimed it as his own. She remembered a man who had shown her kindness, who had taught her to whistle with a blade of grass, who had smiled at her with the same eyes now staring across the hall. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's him," she whispered, tears welling. I knew it was him. The father staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the table as if the marble itself might keep him upright. This is ridiculous," he stammered, his booming voice cracked, desperate. "I rented this hall from respectable businessmen. I signed contracts. This," he pointed a trembling finger at Thomas, "this man is a fraud." But Thomas' voice cut through the noise, calm and merciless. "Fraud?" he repeated, his tone sharp as a blade. "You call me a fraud while you rent my hall from thieves who had no right to lease it? Tell me, did you even read the papers you signed? Or did you simply throw money at the first man who promised you what you wanted?" The father's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence was louder than his arrogance had ever been. The guests turned restless. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter long forgotten. Others looked away, ashamed, unable to meet the gaze of the man they had mocked. Their cruelty had been built on lies, and the truth now weighed heavier than their jewels. Thomas stood taller, his voice rising with quiet power. "You mocked me," he said, sweeping his eyes across the room, meeting the gaze of those who had laughed the loudest. "You called me nothing. You laughed at my clothes, at my silence, at my presence in this hall. But while you mocked, I held the deed to the very ground beneath your feet. While you sneered, I carried the proof of ownership in my hand. While you laughed, you feasted under my roof." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every guest felt it pressing against their chest, a weight they could not shake. No one laughed now. No one dared. At the head table, the bride's father collapsed back into his chair, his pride shattered, his face as pale as parchment. He had mocked the wrong man. And at the back of the hall, in his ragged coat and worn boots, Thomas Hale stood transformed, not a beggar, not a stranger, but the rightful master of the estate. The beggar had become the owner. And the hall, once alive with cruel laughter, now trembled under the silence of shame. For a moment, the deed in Thomas' hand seemed like nothing more than paper creased, weathered, unremarkable. But its silence thundered louder than the laughter that had filled the hall minutes before. Whispers rippled through the guests, frantic and uneven. Some craned their necks, desperate for a closer look. Others shrank back, afraid of what the truth might mean for their own arrogance. The bride's father, red-faced and shaking, barked, "Lies! That document means nothing." His voice cracked under the strain. "This man is a fraudulent actor with forged papers." But then, from the edge of the hall, came the clear voice of an official. A man dressed in a dark suit, part of the management staff who had handled the booking of the estate. He stepped forward, his brow furrowed, his hands clasped nervously. "Sir, those seals." He pointed at the wax imprint glistening under the chandelier. "I recognize them. They're county seals. They cannot be forged so easily." Gasps fluttered through the hall. Another official, summoned by the commotion, examined the papers closely. He traced the embossed seal with his finger, compared the signature with records pulled hastily from a leather folder he carried. His eyes widened. "It's genuine," he said, his voice trembling with both awe and fear. "The deed is authentic. This man, Thomas Hayles, the rightful owner of the estate." The hall erupted into chaos. Some guests cried out in disbelief. Others clutched at their pearls and cufflinks as if their wealth could protect them from their own shame. Laughter was gone now, replaced with gasps that echoed through the marble chamber. The violins stood frozen in their players' hands. The bride's father staggered, his hand gripping the table for balance, his face pale as parchment. The bride herself pressed a hand to her chest, her breath quick and shallow. "It's true," she whispered, her voice breaking with memory. "I knew it. I knew I remembered him." Her words only deepened the silence, her certainty cutting through the room more sharply than the official's confirmation. All at once, the power in the hall shifted. The arrogance, the pride, the mockery, all collapsed beneath the weight of truth. The laughter that had mocked Thomas only minutes before was gone, replaced by gasps, whispers, and the undeniable authority of the deed. And with the silence came a deeper lesson. Thomas did not bask in their silence. He did not smirk or sneer, though every reason for triumph lay at his feet. He could have lorded the deed over them, could have mocked their shame as they mocked his rags, but that was not his way. Instead, he stood calm and steady, a figure carved from patience and suffering, the document resting in his hand like a quiet crown. His presence filled the hall with a weight greater than wealth could ever buy. He did not look at the chandeliers that sparkled above them, nor the roses arranged in gilded vases, nor the marble floor polished to a mirror's shine. No, his eyes traveled across the faces that had twisted into sneers only minutes earlier, faces that had curved into cruel smiles as they laughed at him. Now those same faces bent under the crushing shame of their own cruelty. Their jeweled eyes looked away, their laughter silenced, their arrogance stripped bare. His voice came low and even, yet it rolled through every corner of the hall, filling the silence with steady force. "You judged me by my coat," he began, his tone even but unrelenting. "You mocked me because I came with nothing more than this satchel. You measured my worth in fabric and in coin, and in your eyes I was nothing." He paused, letting the words weigh on them. His gaze swept across the room, slow and piercing, pinning each guest to their guilt. "But tonight you have learned what I already knew. Wealth does not shield you from truth, and dignity does not bow to arrogance." The crowd shifted uneasily. The silks that had once felt soft against their skin now seemed suffocating. Their jeweled necklaces felt more like chains, their golden cufflinks like shackles. They tugged at their collars, adjusted their gowns, yet nothing could free them from the weight pressing into their hearts. Thomas' words grew firmer, though he never once raised his voice in anger. His restraint was powerful enough. "You laughed at me," he continued, each syllable deliberate. "You whispered about me behind your glasses of wine. You pointed me out like a spectacle, a creature to ridicule. You used me as the butt of your jokes to make yourselves feel taller. But what you did not see, what you never cared to look for, was the truth beneath the rags. You did not ask who I was. You did not care to know. And tonight it is not your laughter that echoes in this hall." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp as steel. "It is your shame." A ripple moved through the crowd. Several guests lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze. One groomsman, who had shouted the loudest when the father mocked Thomas, clenched his jaw tight and fixed his stare on the floor, his bravado gone. A woman gripped her string of pearls so tightly that they dug into her palm, the edges biting her flesh, but she refused to unclasp them, as if letting go would mean surrendering the only thing she had left to cling to. The room was thick with guilt, suffocating, inescapable, and Thomas made no effort to spare them from it. He raised the deed once more, not high like a banner of victory, but steady and sure, holding it as one might hold a sacred relic. His voice rang with clarity, sharp and resonant, yet calm. "This paper is proof of ownership," he said. "Proof that the walls around you, the chandeliers above you, the very ground beneath your feet, belong to me. But I tell you this, ownership is not the greatest thing a man can hold. Not land, not halls, not even wealth." His eyes narrowed slightly, and the hall leaned forward, hanging on his words. "The greatest possession any of us can claim is dignity, and it is the one thing you tried to strip from me tonight." His voice deepened, rolling through the hall like the toll of a solemn bell. "But you could not take it, because dignity cannot be mocked away. It cannot be laughed away, and it cannot be bought. It remains, even when a man has nothing else. And tonight, you have seen that for yourselves." The words struck harder than the revelation of the deed itself. The deed was proof of his ownership, but his speech was proof of his strength. A murmur ran through the guests, a tremor of realization, of regret, of understanding too late. Their laughter had been their undoing, and their cruelty had exposed their hollowness more than his rags ever could. Thomas' eyes swept the hall once more, his voice quieter now but heavy with finality. "Remember this night," he said. "Not for the chandeliers, not for the feast, not for the toasts that rang hollow. Remember it because you mocked a man you thought was nothing, and in mocking me, you revealed yourselves." The silence that followed was crushing. It pressed against every chest, sat like stone in every throat. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Even the servants, who had lingered in the shadows, stood still, their eyes wide with awe at the man who had overturned the hall with nothing but truth. The marble beneath their feet did not tremble, yet the hall itself seemed to shake not from sound, but from the sheer weight of dignity pressing down on every soul within its walls. And the bride, more than anyone, was changed forever. She rose from the head table as if waking from a long dream, veil trembling against her shoulders, eyes bright with tears that refused to fall. The hall parted for her without a word. Silk hems brushed marble, chairs scraped softly, and all the glittering faces turned to watch the bride walk the long aisle to the back, toward the man they had mocked, the man now standing with the deed in his weathered hand. She stopped an arm's length from him, breath unsteady, voice a fragile thread. "Sir Thomas," she said, tasting the name like a memory, "may I speak to you?" He did not move to claim the moment, did not press his advantage. He only lowered the paper and met her gaze with the same quiet steadiness she remembered from summers long ago. The hush drew tighter. Somewhere near the head table, her father stirred in protest, but the bride didn't look back. Her eyes were fixed on Thomason the lines hardship had carved, on the dignity that hardship had not erased. "I knew you," she whispered, the words spilling out before she could arrange them. "When I was little, on this land, you showed me how to whistle on a blade of grass. You helped me cross the low wall when I was afraid it'd fall. You laughed when I brought you daisies and called them a bouquet." The faintest smile touched Thomas' mouth, and the memory rippled through the hall, warmer than any chandelier's glow. The bride swallowed. I forgot you. I let myself forget what kindness looks like without jewels. A tremor moved through the room, shame, shifting, inexpensive. Clothes yet, she went on. I was silent while they laughed at you, while I laughed at you, in my heart, by doing nothing. I am sorry. Her voice broke and steadied again. I am sorry for my silence. I am sorry for my pride. I am sorry for believing a suit is proof of a soul. Thomas's fingers eased on the folder's edge. He held the deed the way a man holds a keepsake, not a weapon. You were a child then, he said softly, his voice textured with gravel and grace. And tonight, you were a daughter, pulled by a current stronger than truth, but you remembered. He nodded once, as if to seal something quiet and sacred between them. That is enough. She shook her head. It isn't. Not for what we did to you. Her hands lifted, then fell, unsure where to place apology in a room that had used him for sport. After a heartbeat, she did the only honest thing left. She offered her hand, palm open, nothing to bargain with. Thank you for this roof, for this land, for being more than what we saw. He looked at that open hand, unarmored, unadorned, and placed his own in it. A simple clasp, rough skin to soft, past to present. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't recompense. It was recognition, the first true one of the night. The sound that followed was not applause. It was a collective breath, released as if the hall itself had been holding it since the doors first opened. In that touch, the corners of Thomas's grief loosened. Margaret's ring, warm in his pocket, felt suddenly lighter, as if approved by a presence he still carried. The weight of years, the bridges, the shelters, the stairs did not vanish, but it shifted, no longer the whole of him. He folded the deed without haste and let his hand fall gently away, dignity intact, spirit restored by something no seal could guarantee. Being seen. Behind them, the father half rose, pride fighting for air, but the bride lifted a small, steadying palm without turning. Not defiance definition. She stood as herself at last. Then she bowed her head to Thomas, a bride curtsying to the host she should have greeted first. Thank you, she said again, clearer now, and the words rang like a bell that called the room to honesty. The spell of wealth as worth cracked, fine and final. Faces softened, shoulders lowered. The quartet's bows hovered, unsure whether to re-enter a night that no longer belonged to spectacle. Thomas tucked the folder back into the satchel, as if returning a heart to a chest, and when he straightened, the bride's eyes held nothing of pity-only respect. The highs night ended differently than anyone expected. The feast lay untouched. Silver platters of roasted meats, golden bowls of fruits, crystal glasses of champagne, all of it glittered in the candlelight, all of it prepared to impress. Yet now, no one raised a fork. No one dared sip from their glass. The food had lost its flavor. The drink had lost its sweetness, for the only taste left in the mouths of the guests was the bitterness of shame. The chandeliers blazed above, scattering diamonds of light across the marble floor, but their glow no longer felt magnificent. It felt harsh, almost accusing, exposing every wrinkle of guilt, every downcast eye, every restless shuffle. The music that had once soared with violins and laughter sat dead in the air. The musicians frozen, their bows laid quietly across their laps. Beauty still surrounded them, but it mocked them now, reminding them that they had chosen cruelty over kindness, arrogance over humility. One by one, the guests began to rise. Their chairs scraped against the marble, a sound that rang hollow in the silence. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns worth fortunes suddenly seemed small. their grandeur fading with every step they took toward the exit. They moved without ceremony, their heads bowed, whispers trailing after them like smoke from a dying fire. He owned it all along, one man muttered hoarsely, his voice breaking. All this time a jeweled woman clutched her fan against her chest, her knuckles white. "We mocked him under his own roof," she whispered, eyes glistening. "God forgive us." The groomsmen, who had once strutted with arrogance, filed out quietly, their faces pale, their lips pressed tight with regret. The young ladies who had giggled behind lace gloves now clutched those gloves in trembling fingers, their laughter gone, replaced with the sting of conscience. Even the servants, who had long endured the pride of the wealthy, stood in awe, watching silently as the truth reshaped the hall before their eyes. And still, at the head table, the bride's father remained seated. His body sagged into the chair that had once elevated him above the room. His glass lay toppled on its side, the champagne bleeding into the white cloth, a spreading stain that marked the death of his pride. He stared at the liquid pooling across the table, his eyes hollow, his mouth slack. The man who had commanded the evening with arrogance, who had filled the air with boasts and cruelty, now sat like a broken idol worshipped, once discarded now, stripped of all reverence. The bride, her veil trembling against her shoulders, glanced at him one last time. Her heart ached with sorrow, but not pity. What she felt was the grief of seeing her father's pride reduced to ash, of realizing the empire he built was nothing more than fragile glass. She turned her eyes instead to Thomas, who stood calm and steady, a figure both humbling and unshakable. And then came the sound that drew every gaze. Thomas Hale closed the folder with deliberate care, as though sealing not just paper but history itself. He slid the deed back into his weathered satchel, the same satchel they had mocked, the same satchel they had dismissed. Tonight, it was revealed not as a beggar's burden, but as a vessel of truth and authority. He straightened, his shoulders squaring, his presence swelling until it filled every corner of the grand hall. His coat was still frayed, his boots still cracked, but they no longer looked like symbols of poverty. They looked like battle scars proof of a life endured, a life overcome. The rags no longer diminished him, they exalted him. His steps across the marble were steady, unhurried. Each echo of his boots struck like a drumbeat of justice. He did not lower his head, nor rush for the doors. He walked as though the hall itself were bending around him, acknowledging him as its true master. The guests, though leaving, parted for him, their eyes lowered, their bodies shifting aside with reverence they had not thought him worthy of only hours earlier. When he reached the towering doors, he paused. He did not turn back to gloat, did not sneer at the man who had tried to humiliate him, nor at the guests who had joined in the cruelty. He paused not to wound them further, but to leave them with words that would haunt them forever. His voice carried through the silence, steady and final, deep as the earth itself. They mocked the man they thought was homeless, but he walked away owning the very ground beneath their feet. The words landed like thunder. Some guests flinched. Others bowed their heads even lower, as though the weight of his truth pressed them deeper into their shame. The bride's father closed his eyes, tears of humiliation burning down his face, for he knew he would never escape those words. They would follow him, whispered in drawing rooms and parlors, echoed in every memory of this night. Thomas Hale pushed open the doors, and the night air poured into the hall. Cool, fresh, clean. swept across the marble floor like a benediction, chasing out the stench of arrogance, washing over the guests like mercy they did not deserve. And then he stepped through, his figure framed by the glow of the chandeliers behind him and the darkness of freedom ahead. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had reclaimed more than a hall, more than land, more than paper. He had reclaimed his dignity, his truth, his place. The doors closed slowly behind him, the sound echoing like the final toll of judgment. Inside, the guests sat stunned, humbled, silenced. Outside, Thomas walked into the night knot as a beggar mocked and broken, but as the true master of the hall they would never forget.